right, welcome back to the Living Streams Church podcast, everybody out there in the big world. Good to be with you again, Anthony. Hope you're doing well.
I am. How about you?
Doing real good. This is episode 4 of our Being Human podcast, which is a companion piece to our sermon series at Living Streams Church called Being Human. And also we've done 4 messages along those lines. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and definitely felt that this was a pertinent issue in society and kind of in the evolution of man, even potentially, as we've been talking just about different things you're going through, different things the world's going through, and trying to get not ahead of this, like we have some sort of, advanced understanding about all these things, but definitely trying to add some helpful maybe wisdom or at least some companionship to those who are dealing with the changes coming because of the artificial intelligence age that has dawned, and that we are rapidly entering into. And the way we've been saying it is we want to get rooted in a biblical anthropology, a biblical understanding of what it means to be human and what actually human flourishing is, so that we won't get disoriented no matter what happens with the artificial intelligence. And also so that we can stand against the dehumanizing that's going on in our political era. And not to say that there hasn't been dehumanizing in a lot of different political eras, but definitely seems like we might be doing as good as anyone in the dehumanizing as far as our political era. And some of with, the different personalities that are in place, the different challenges that the world is going through. I mean, COVID, obviously, we've mentioned that a few times on the podcast, was such a catalyst for things, but also such a revealer of things, I think. And so we've been trying to do that, and we just went through the 4th of July weekend.
That's right.
And it's been really fun to 4th of July on the weekend is always a lot of fun, just because it adds to some of the freedom to celebrate and all those things. But it's also been World Cup on the North American continent. And so the U.S. has really been celebrating a lot, and a lot of people have been celebrating the U.S., even though maybe in their country they hear negative things about the U.S. They come here and have experienced some really good times. So what was your 4th of July weekend like, Anthony?
Yeah. Well, also I'll reference it was our 250th 4th of July.
Yes.
That's how the math works.
Birthday, yeah.
Birthday. And so, no, it was great. We, we were able to celebrate kind of with family here in New York. But I think this, I've been involved with this group called Freedom 250 that has been planning a lot of the events that have been happening on the national level around the 4th. And so, a lot of this is sort of like nonpartisan and made just to sort of celebrate this milestone. But it's felt like, I don't know, patriotism vibes are all time high in the Canada household, just because like we're able to pause and reflect and look back at the last 250 years of this country, ask some of the, kind of bigger questions. And, I think maybe for an optimist in a way like me, like looking forward to the next 250 and wondering kind of, where are we headed as a country? So it feels like it's not just another 4th of July, but it was a chance to, kind of like reflect and look forward as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge milestone. I somewhat jokingly, but somewhat seriously, have always talked about how historically any nation that becomes a empire or a world power, really only lasts about 300 years. And that's true historically. I mean, it's just, and some of them don't last that long. Some of them last a little longer. But that seems to be somewhat of a mark where there's a rise and then there's a decline, the rise and fall. And so I was actually talking with a group the other day, and I mentioned that, and it was when I mentioned it, I also was thinking about the 200. So I was like, we got another good 50 years, man. So let's make this thing count. And again, that's not necessarily, the reality of what has to happen, but it is, something historically I think we should be aware of and understand that history teaches us a lot of things. And so unless we can continue probably doing the things we did at the beginning, then we will see some sort of decline and all of that. So, yeah,
Yeah.
we were in California, Southern California, kind of that mid coast between San Diego and LA, which is our favorite place.
Cool.
And we got to be there with our family, and yeah, we were in a Costco parking lot watching fireworks shot out from Legoland. She's like,
Awesome.
that seemed pretty American right there. Um, yeah, I got, my one daughter just turned 20, so they're not all teenage girls anymore, but they still seem pretty teenage girl to me, and they all wanted to go different directions at all the same times, and so it was kind of fun keeping everybody together. But yeah, it was wonderful weather. It was, surrounded by people who were just really happy to celebrate. We were
Yeah.
actually driving down the street, right on Highway, 101, going up the coast, and it was 4th of July, and this guy was driving a Volkswagen bus, so a double slug bug for all those who know what
Mhm.
that means, a Volkswagen bus, and it was literally coated. The entire thing was coated in like cheerleader pom poms.
Oh,
So it was
okay.
literally like shimmering as it drove, like sparkling and shimmering as it drove. And then it just had this massive American flag out the back. And
Amazing.
people were all honking and cheering as it just drove by. I thought this was pretty fun.
Be more
Yeah, so
patriotic.
it was cool to see, in a Volkswagen, which was funny too.
Mm.
But yeah, it was cool. And yeah, I think there's a lot of good American sentiment right now,
Yeah.
which is wonderful because she is a great place. Obviously not perfect and lots of challenges, but the land of opportunity, no doubt. People from all over
Yeah.
the world are still trying to get here for some of that opportunity. And we've got challenges galore. And I think we
Yeah.
mentioned it even before. Like when I lived in Ireland, the nation was so homogenous as far as everyone there was pretty much Irish, pretty much a farmer for so long that it was pretty easy to govern. I mean, they still had issues and challenges that we know of, but the diversity of America from the very beginning has just created immense, immense challenges, the size and the diversity. But it's a
Yeah.
beautiful mess, It's a
Yeah.
beautiful mess. And hopefully we can continue to, you know, love each other and put forth the values that really matter. And hopefully this podcast will help everyone understand what human flourishing really is, from a biblical standpoint. And hopefully we can continue to have awakenings,
Yes.
when we're headed in the wrong direction, and have another really good, 250 or more
Yeah.
years as a nation.
I've I've always appreciated how we have language in the like lexicon of our nation around the American experiment and to be a
Mm,
more perfect union, right? This idea
yeah.
of betterment, striving towards ideals.
Mm,
And I do think a lot of that is uniquely us, uniquely American, that we're an unfinished kind of picture and tapestry.
yeah.
So I love that there's some awareness, self awareness of that in the
That's
canon
so good.
of American literature, or not literature, but
Yes.
American historical record.
Yeah. Yeah. And anything else on the Freedom 250? I mean, what was some of your favorite, experiences, or what were some of the most
Yeah,
challenging with the, political kind of, um, you know,
yeah.
intensity there?
Well, I'd say in there's one just kind of fun tactical story. For folks who might have been listening, like I'm a marketer by trade. I've done a lot of events in particular in my career, and which kind of drew me, when asked to be a part of this. Um, and what's crazy is the 4th of July was planned as like an outdoor event, obviously, right? And there's
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of people that were coming to celebrate this like major kind of fireworks show. And what any event marketer will tell you is planning outdoor events are really unpredictable. And there just
Yeah.
happens to be out here on the East Coast. It felt I missed home a little bit. It's been an extreme heat wave that has passed through
Oh,
the
wow.
East Coast, which means like 95 degrees in New York. But turn up the humidity, right? And it like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
factors it averages out miserable.
And people
Um,
just aren't used to it either. Yeah.
you're not used to it. We lost power. It's been a whole thing. But what I didn't know, and any meteorology kind of experts fact check me on this, But the end of a major heat wave comes with like a thunderstorm that kind of breaks the wave
Okay.
and sort of starts
Okay.
brings us back down to level. And so a major thunderstorm hit Washington, D.C., with hundreds of thousands of people actively at this live event. And so the event team, and I wasn't there in person, but I'm on the like text thread basically with the team,
Mhm.
had to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people into like the Smithsonian Museum, to all these other places
Oh my
until
goodness.
the storm passed. And so from an event like logistics perspective, quite a mess.
Yeah.
But as for those that might have watched along at home, kind of fun ending to the story. 11:30 p.m. on the 4th of July, the fireworks did start. Folks came back, and there's all these videos on like X and social media of folks like basically, um, you know, sheltered at the lobby of like a museum, singing the national anthem, like, having kind of these like
Cool.
moments.
Created all these like smaller moments. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, just as a marketer, it was like the courage to make that decision is always difficult. You had so much expectations. People are going to write like horrible stories about it online, just
Mm.
given the partisan kind of nature of that we're living in. But it kind of felt like, something. I felt very proud to like be somewhat affiliated here with this team that pulled
Yeah.
off something when a major external force like a 80-mile-per-hour wind
Yeah.
thunderstorm kind of
Yeah.
comes through. So I think that's one just an anecdote from behind the scenes that sometimes folks don't see. But the other piece is like, and I hinted towards this, like I got asked to be a part of this. It's the 250th. It aligned to like my skill set as a marketer and event person. And as you know from the podcast, I'm figuring out what I'm doing with my life, and so opportunistically felt like a good thing to be a part of. But anytime we affiliate with something that had, even if it's nonpartisan in nature, but like at the edges is like affiliated with or an extension of kind of a specific kind of political party, it invites so much, I don't know, negative thoughts or comments or what have you, despite best intention. And so I would say, it's been really, it's done a few things for me. One, I've really just enjoyed being a part of it. It's a very short tour of duty. I think I've got another couple weeks left, and then we'll kind of transition out of it. And I feel really proud of being part of it, but also out in like the culture. It's sort of like I'm almost like sad at how this is being perceived potentially from a lot of other people. And there's a whole lot that we can talk about it, but it just brought me back to this idea of the dehumanization of how politics is sort of accelerating the dehumanization, at least in today's context, and how glad I am that is part of this sermon series and this
Yeah.
conversation that we're having. And it's not
Yeah.
just about AI, because I think that is a force all its own, that is contributing to the state of how we treat each other, kind of what our thought life looks like, what we see and consume on social media.
Mm.
And so I'm just appreciative that that's something that, we're discussing,
Yeah.
and that's a big part of this equation.
Yeah. Because it's easy. It would be easy to dehumanize. Easy to, even to stand against the dehumanization in a dehumanizing way, which
Yeah.
is just, it seems like so many people are falling into that trap all the time. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to celebrate with what America and the experiment, like you were saying,
Yeah.
has made possible for a lot of humanity. Again,
Yes.
not perfect in any way, and has a lot of work still to be done. But yeah, some of that goes to the way that the framers, wrote and thought, in those early documents and in the early decisions. With Washington and Jefferson and Adams and many many others. And I've been thinking a little bit about that too, because Alex's message on Sunday,
Mm.
just 2 days ago for us, not sure when it is as for the listeners, but yeah, he was talking about the telos of man, or the telos, whatever, telos, which is a Greek word, I think, just describing kind of the purpose of mankind. That the end, I think, is actually what the word means. Like, so what's the end? Where are we supposed to end up? If we did everything right, where would we end up as humans? And this has been a concept that literally has been around philosophically from the beginning of time. And some of what we've talked about in the sermon series is the origin of man, as far as Genesis and the creation of man, and how man came into existence, and what were the purposes and reasons for that. We've talked a little bit about how God, God, the creator of everything, considers mankind, and how he's raised us up in value and levels that just don't even make sense to us when we think about who we really are, that we are just, dust with his breath, or any of those type of things. And so we've talked, about a lot of that. We've talked about how we're body, we're soul, we're spirit, or as Jesus, said from Matthew and the great Shema, that we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So there's more. We're kind of like multi-layered in who we are, and each one of those realities is so important, but not more important than the others. So we've talked a lot about the like origins, a little bit about kind of the makeup and the structure and the substance of who we are. But I love that Alec took us into this idea of, okay, so how would we know if we've ended up in the right spot? And there's been lots of stabs at this throughout human history to try and answer this question. And he used the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a great place to go for this question, even though you're not going to get what you want, and you're not really going to get what you would think you would get, because Ecclesiastes is the study of this guy Solomon, who was king over Israel at a point where Israel was world power, literally, and they had peace in all the nations around. In fact, the only interactions they had with other nations was the other nations would come just to learn from Solomon's wisdom, and supposedly Solomon, was the wisest man that ever lived. God had endowed him with a certain amount of wisdom that was unmatched before and after. And so he, in this book, says, I set out to really figure out, what was meaningful and what wasn't. What was the end of man. And his conclusion over and over and over again is it's all meaningless. And he uses this word heval, which is basically, I've heard people describe it as soap bubbles. Everything is just soap bubbles, or everything is just vapor, or everything is wood, hay, and stubble that's just going to burn away. And he moans how no matter how hard he works to get stuff, he's going to die, and it's going to be left to someone who may or may not care about the things he cares about. He talks about how pleasure, I gave myself to pleasure. He had 1,000 wives or concubines at one point. So literally, that's giving himself to some pleasure, which sounds like a headache also. But he realizes it was all meaningless. It was complete vapor, soap bubbles. It was hevel. He says, I worked really hard and was really diligent, and I realized it was just vapor. And so he just keeps going on, and you're like, wait a second, I thought this was the Bible. I thought that he was going to tell me something like, you just need to do this and everything will be great. And he doesn't. Yeah. And you just read chapter after chapter after chapter, and it's very depressed. And basically his conclusion at one point is, everyone who is born and lives is somewhat miserable because truly they're just hevel. Every decision they make doesn't matter. None of it matters. They just die in the end. And even the people who die, they actually have a benefit, because now they're not stuck in this hevel cycle. But he said, but even then, we don't even know what happens there, so we can't put any choice. So his conclusion is, it's really the best is for the people who are never born. You're like, what are we talking about here? I'm reading the Bible, bro. Give me something good. But it's truth is what sets us free. And so even though we don't want to hear those things, it's still challenging. But then what he does say is, he does start to talk about, well, even though everything is hevel, it's like there are some things that have more value than others. So justice is still hevel, because doesn't last necessarily, but it has more value than injustice. And ultimately, she starts to talk about what gives you peaceful sleep is really more valuable hevel than not more value than less valuable hevel. And if you're doing injustice, you're not going to sleep well. If you're doing justice, you're going to sleep well. So I mean, that's what he's breaking this down to, and then finally gets to this ultimate conclusion. He says, and this is what I understand: the chief end of man, the telos of man, is to fear God and to keep his commandments. And even though that feels a lot like hevel also, it's less hevel than the other things, less vanity than the other things. And Alec just did a great job of talking us through that. But really, the fear of God is to awe God, to acknowledge God, is to realize that there is something else that isn't hevel, and to put your hope in that. And then to keep the commandments of God, trusting that God is the architect of this whole thing, and what he has written into the fabric of humanity will be less hevel than the others. And again, it's interesting because it honestly doesn't seem like Solomon is spending any time considering what happens after life. And actually, I've done a little study into David and Solomon. David was Solomon's father. So King David killed Goliath. His son was King Solomon. And their, eschatology maybe, or what happens after life, is kind of interesting to think about. I don't think they had a lot of deep thoughts along those lines. I think they just believed that there was a God and God would take care of it. But they were really considered on what happens in this life. And Solomon's phrase in there also is under the sun. He talks about everything under the sun is hevel. So he could be using that to even say, I'm just looking at this reality of what's right in front of here, mankind, blood, flesh, water, and I see hevel. Not making a claim as to what happens outside of the sun, like whatever's not under the sun. And so I think he is kind of tipping his hat a little bit at the end, saying, hey, fear God and keep his commandments, because there's a chance there's something after this that you're going to be really glad you did the less hevel stuff than the other, than the more hevel stuff. So I thought that was so interesting, as looking at what those guys were describing back then. And I know you're trying to figure out a lot of what is meaningful, what is purpose, what is the telos of Anthony right now. So tell us a little bit more about that too.
I was going to interject that Ecclesiastes feels like the original like emo genre of
Dashboard Confessionals.
The old, yeah, exactly. Solomon Confessional.
So true.
Yeah, because I think, and again, I that resonates so deeply with a lot of the things that I guess I'm considering, vocationally at least, because when we're able to take a step back and think about what matters most under the sun, at least the best that we can discern, obviously I think Solomon's wisdom is right and pure, and for those of us who follow Jesus, a much a fulfillment of the Mosaic law and adherence to that Solomon is pushing and recommending. And so with that, first and foremost is our meaning that we seek. Beyond that, it starts to get into, okay, what am I doing as a father, as a husband, as a contributing member of society? And it's easy to fall into some of the ways that we have tried to construct meaning in a world that all of that stuff at its atomic level may not matter, in that we have this American inspired thing of up and to the right, and that's what our career has to do. And so it's easy to fall in the trap of like, okay, I'm turning 40. It's like 401k plan, retirement planning and life insurance. And like, how do we sort of like, achieve the American dream? And again, I'm not saying there's all of that is bad, having some degree of responsibility and
Mm.
um, intention and ambition in a healthy context.
Yep.
It's just a construct that we've created in a world where, um, if we, in a world where everything is temporal and we are, you know, as Solomon says, like everything is meaningless to some degree. And so, again, I don't want to, again, the hope in this is Jesus's atoning act on the cross and what that means for us as believers in life everlasting with him. So I don't want to keep going down the path
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
not sort of
Yeah.
like say there is good news here on the other
Mhm.
side of this. But as someone who is kind of navigating career decisions that have implications like this, we texted about this a little bit. I'm going to have to travel a lot because in the COVID era, when remote work was a thing,
Mhm.
we made a decision to move to Phoenix and get rooted and join a church community and help kind of establish kind of a school, kind of all these things that we've done, that both sets of grandparents, right? Pulling back in a world where now things are moving back into the office, and I work in a specific industry that Phoenix just isn't sort of home to.
Mm.
um, I have to make a decision on spending time away from my family in order to kind of pursue some of these constructs that I've been given and that we've all sort of thought through. So all that to be said, um, in a way, I'm having an emo moment of does any of this matter? Like
Mhm.
does a retirement whatever matter in a world where we're alive today, and you know is the trade-off today worth of access and time and presence with my kids the right trade-off for their future security? And then you get the peppered in like tweets from some of these AI futurists of like, well, work won't even matter in the future, money doesn't matter
Yeah.
anymore, like it will go away, which again I don't believe. um, and then it just kind of creates more of this sort of like unsettledness around all of it.
Well, let
So
me
all
ask
that
you a
to be
question
said,
in
yeah.
there. As far as because what you're describing is so pertinent with all of this, that you're trying to make some life decisions, you and your wife, for your family, for this moment, that you're not wanting to bite into the marketing about Hevel. You need this, you need this, you need this, you need this, you need to make this
Right.
much, you need to have this much, you need to be this much, you have this much following. Like you're trying to say, okay, what of that is Hevel and what of that isn't?
Yeah.
And what compromises are you willing to make on the family side, on your own personal, like, kind of like integrity, not integrity, but like your personal, like, health side,
Mhm.
to say, okay, I'm going to try and do some work that's meaningful and good, use the gifts God had given me to produce and create in the world that can then be fruitful for my family in some capacity. Like, do you have some, I will not compromise this? Like, have you been able to kind of line out, say, well, there's my wife and I, we've talked, and there's these three things we will not give on,
Yeah.
and then these things we would be willing to, or are you still in the mix of all of that?
I think if you asked me a year ago, I'd have a really like profound answer to that question
Okay.
that says
Okay.
yes. Here's our boundaries. Like here's what we think is like I will, I'm willing to travel up towards this amount of time, and um, you know, we're home for dinner. Like all the sort of things that I think in the pre AI context I had some leverage, and
Mm.
to some, in a small sense, like leverage belonged to the candidates, not to, or the employees, much less so the employers. And that
Okay.
happened, remote work, I think, is a good example of that, where getting employees to come back in the office was really tough after COVID.
Yeah.
And so people
Yeah.
had real estate that they couldn't fill because all the power and leverage was with the employee and not with the employer.
Okay.
That shifted in my industry. And I don't know if
Interesting.
that's a bellwether for others. In that, now, if you want the good job or whatever, and
Yeah.
again, this isn't like, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but you have to be in the office a certain amount of days. And so a lot of the conversations I've been having with mentors and others is like, you have, it's not that you have to, like for sure there is sort of like a boundary you have to observe as a family. And again, I think we have that, but like I have to give more and I have to compromise, which might mean for me, either I have to travel more in this context, like, or relocate my family, by the way, which I think that's our boundary. We don't want to do that. We want to stay
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Phoenix.
No, that's huge.
Um, but that means I have to live at an airport or,
Yeah.
be on the road a lot more. Um, or there's another trade-off, by the way, which is I will not work in this industry, or I will
Mm.
pursue more meaningful work at the expense of sort of maybe the career equity I've built, or kind of, what the pay could be, or whatever the case is. And that's another potential trade-off. But I'm sharing all this because the overwhelming advice I'm hearing is, whatever sort of design knowledge workers, I'll say in particular, people who worked in technology or work in front of a computer all day,
Yeah.
have had for our careers, we've done nothing wrong, but everything changed.
Yeah.
And we have to now figure it out. And the reality is, that means us compromising on whatever sort of picture we might have had on how the next 10, 20 years are going. And so I don't have all the answers, but
Yeah.
maybe the bottom line, at least what we've started with as a family, is we're not relocating, and
Yeah.
everything else is going to have to, like, work around that.
Yeah. Well, a couple more questions just to dig into. You mentioned maybe having to go find, like, so one is, stick in the career path that you've carved out, that you've developed, and all of those things, and have to travel more. Or you said potentially do more meaningful work, and just
Mhm.
not in that industry, or maybe not with a paycheck that is
Yeah.
more sizable or whatever. What do you mean by more meaningful work? I'm
I,
challenging. I want to challenge you here a little
yeah,
bit on this.
I recognize.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what were you thinking when you said meaningful work?
Well, I
Were you talking
recognize
about being
that.
a pastor? Whoa, so
No,
meaningful.
honestly, like, well, we should talk about that. Honestly, I recognize what I signaled there was
Yeah, yeah,
working in tech is not meaningful work, or
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
it
yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah,
I don't want to signal
yeah. No,
that.
we're
I
not
think,
saying that at all, for sure.
yeah, and I think there's a whole, honestly, like, that's probably a whole episode in and of itself, or a whole discussion. And that, like,
Mm,
how do we define meaning in our work? Is
yeah,
it just sort of, I don't know, is it the missionary, is it the, whatever, folks that are explicitly like advancing the gospel, serving
yeah,
others, or is there implicit value with the work that we're doing in our communities of
yeah,
teams and companies and others, and how the work we're doing, at least in tech, sometimes is part of like the overall like supply chain that doctors
yeah.
and hospitals and folks that do good work actually do. So again, I don't want to say it's not
I
meaningful.
think for me on that, I think it all just comes down to the design. People use the term original design, like pray and
Mm,
ask God, what is your original design? And whether or not that's not a biblical phrase or anything, but it's getting at this question, say, God, what do you want me to do? I remember actually, um, one of the times so yes, I'm a pastor. It's kind of all I've ever done, and maybe missionary pastor combo.
yeah.
And it's not anything I ever wanted to do. I didn't set out on this path. It just stumbled into it over and over and over again, and finally realized, oh, maybe this is what I'm supposed to do. But when we would go, every 6 years, my wife and I, we quit and we go. And so we go on what we call a missional sabbatical. We go spend a year somewhere, and we try and figure out what the Lord is doing and try and help that happen, in a missionary type, concept. And what it does is it really brings us to a place of rest and
Yeah.
sabbatical, in the sense that we're not doing the same things that we were doing, and we're going to a place where nobody knows us and nobody cares at all that we're there. And so you don't get a lot of emails. I mean,
Yeah.
that's my big joke is I know I'm on missional sabbatical, even though I'm like doing missions, and sometimes we've lived in really challenging situations. But the fact that if I get an email, I'm so excited. I'm literally like, yes, and I'll spend so much time on this email instead of just being flooded, right?
Yeah, totally.
So it's kind of interesting, but we went to this place, and after 3 months of being in a spot where literally nobody knew who we were, and nobody cared a drop about who we were, it's amazing the stripping that can happen to your soul, and especially after being at a church that people seem to care a lot about the pastor or whatever. So
Yeah.
going there, it's amazing. And all of a sudden I go through these like I become an emo guy for sure. I'm journaling a lot, and I'm pick up my guitar a lot more, and I'm just lost a little bit so quickly. So quickly I can become super disoriented, super confused, and go through basically identity crisis. It's fascinating how quickly it can happen. And one of my friends, Stephen Lovekin, he actually told me, hey, why don't you just go outside one morning and just sit there and ask God, what do you see when you look at me? Like, who am I? And I was like, okay, whatever. And it just so happened this time we were living right near the Caribbean. And so literally we could see the sun coming up. And so I just sat there, and I remember asking the Lord that question and just sitting there kind of thinking this is a little silly, or even if something comes into my mind, how am I going to know it's God and not just me making something up? And I remember real clearly I felt kind of something else mingle with my thoughts. And so that's a way that I describe when God's speaking to me. It's in my own head and it's my own thoughts, but it's thoughts that don't seem like they're coming from me. It's like there's this mingling going on. And what it was when I see you, I see a fisher of men who helps people see the kingdom. And it was funny because I thought that, and that's not too far off of maybe something I could come up with on my own. Like, this is what I want to be, or this is what I feel like I've been. But when I thought about it, there was like something leapt in my soul. Like Jonathan Edwards talks about, my heart was strangely warmed that day. And it was like something just kind of like kindled. Yeah. And I thought, okay, well, that's what I want to be. But then it was interesting because all of a sudden it was like my mind started to be flooded with these memories of that's what I have been at different times. And not perfectly in any way, but it was like, okay, so I have been that. I want to be that. I am that. And it was just this interesting, like, kind of identity moment happening. And I've gone back to that so many times when I feel lost. Well, at the end of the day, I'm a fisher of men. I help people see God's kingdom. So guess what? I could do any job and still be that, and still live into that calling. And so even when I'm at my pastor job where it seems like, oh yeah, you're doing that. It's funny. Sometimes, being real here, like, I don't know if I'm that good at being a pastor for the women in the church. Like, sometimes I just think, well, I don't know. Like, we have women to do that, and we have guys who are better at kind of navigating that reality. And I do whatever I can. And whenever someone tells me you should do it, I'm like, I'll do that. And then when they say you're doing a bad job of that, I'm like, yeah, I'm probably doing a bad job of that. But it's funny, but then I'll kind of stumble back to this thing. But at the same time, like, I'm a fisher of men who helps people see the kingdom. And so there's this part of me that's just like, okay, well, I can't be everything. I'll try and continue to not get in the way of good things. But at the same time, I'm going to continue to, even in this work, try and narrow the field to say, well, this is, I think, my real contribution to society. Yes. And if I'm doing this, I think it's probably going to be the most benefit to everybody, even if I'm not directly contributing to them in any way. So it's been a real helpful thing for me.
Incredible.
And so I think you've been on that path, continuing to ask that question and get some of those things. Have you like, what are some of the answers you feel like maybe for you? I know it's personal, but we're trying to be companions here for the people in this intersection.
I'll answer the question, but I think it also gives what I heard you say, though, was like calling can help, like discerning your calling can be a
Identity,
valuable
even. Yeah.
instrument, identity, to sort of like, one, make some of these decisions at the intersection that are happening, because we have sort of a true north that we're aligning towards.
Yeah.
To your point, like, I don't think anyone running an organization, a church, I think is great at everything, but like, what your calling is and how to fish the men and women who can help support that one area that you might be great at. And I think that's like an incredibly valuable thing. Um, and one thing on the theological side, which I'd love to dig into maybe after I answer your question, is this calling, purpose, identity feel like meaning in response to the telos and the conversation in Ecclesiastes, right?
Yeah.
Where we now can apply meaning, which when rooted in a biblical context isn't meaningless. Like, it's like having sort of calling actually gives us something to get out of bed for every day and to work towards. So to answer your question, I don't know. I'm in a very interesting like counter example, maybe, where I'm praying the prayer, but I'm not hearing the direct answer yet. Doesn't mean I'm stopping to pray or stopping praying and asking.
Yeah.
But I feel like I am in a season of change where the way I would have answered that question again for the first half of my career, what is just radically different than if anything, if what I'm hearing is is where I'm being led for the next season. And so what I'm trying to do is just, one, again, be in prayer about it, have sort of ears to hear type of mentality or posture, to sort of commune with God throughout the day, not just when I'm in my quiet time, but when I'm in my inbox, when I'm talking to mentors, when I'm on podcasts like this one, and being open to wherever God might lead. And so I think what I hunger for, to be vulnerable, is that conviction of calling to say, well, this, not that it makes things like super easy, but it just gives you sort of a filter by which you could make decisions. Like, my time in tech is done. Like, I care about health, and so Phoenix Children's is an opportunity. Or, you know what I mean? Like, you can start to really,
or like seminary. You started going to seminary.
Totally. And I still think, like, if anything, I'm like, gosh, I gotta like I wish, again, very candidly, I financially could support just like taking 2 years and finishing seminary. Like, that would be amazing, because I'm in an active posture of listening and getting edified theologically. Then if I emerge a pastor, great. I don't think that's necessarily, I don't know, who knows, but I don't think that's where it would lead. But I would feel like that tug on my heart I have fully ran towards, right? But the reality of just, where we are as a family is I can't do that. I can do it part-time, and I am. But I'm on the like 8-year program for a 2-year degree, basically, is sort of
which is great.
current.
Which is great. I mean, I always joke a little bit, and I know people who run seminaries won't like that I say this, but I sort of feel like if you've taken 1 or 2 seminary classes, you kind of got seminary. Like, that's what it is.
Really?
And it's literally just, devoted, guided time of studying God and theology and all those things, which, but it's good to get a taste of that, and to say, okay, like, this is how it would work, and get exposed to some of the writers who have come before and some of the thoughts going on. But I know for me, I did seminary mostly because I wouldn't really do it on my own. I needed the accountability. I needed the guidance.
Sure.
I needed all of those things. So that's why I did, the full seminary. But some people, you could take a couple seminary classes, you'd be like, bam, I got you have that self-discipline or whatever to do it on your own. But some people don't. But there's also like the cohort reality, which is tricky these days, because so many, like, online it's like, well, how are we processing the information when we're online versus in person? And so there's a lot of different things there. But I wanted to ask you a question on that. As you're trying to see, so the one of the reasons, and I'm just because I've walked with you for a while, we talk, when we say intersection, we're talking about the intersection of work or career interrupted by tech, well, particular AI today, but then also faith, which I think probably lends itself more to the philosophical, the meaning, the telos of man. So when those three things crash together at maybe a midlife reality, or maybe you're just starting out in career and all of a sudden the world's changed so much since you graduated college, so you're already at that intersection, or maybe you're getting old enough now to where you're at that intersection going, I don't know what to do. So like that's what this whole podcast is trying to meet you at that intersection and provide some companionship. And I love your honesty and vulnerability in that, but also maybe a little bit of wisdom and those type of things. So one of the reasons why you say you're still struggling with this is because, you know, you were very successful in the marketing kind of coming out of Silicon Valley. You were very successful in a lot of ways. And then as your family grew and as your own kind of heart and maturity grew, and you decided, hey, I want to kind of go at this a different way. And then as soon as that happened, the technology changed so much. And so you've been really trying to say, okay, how do I continue to live in this more mature reality, including with wife and kids and all that, but also do the work? And you're just finding this challenge. Like when you were younger and single, maybe you could just grind it out. But now you have more things. Your kuleana, your responsibility has grown. And so how do I tend to the garden of my own family and soul, as well as continue to contribute in this kind of dog eat dog, you know, cutting edge, got to move fast reality. And one of the reasons why you're saying I still don't know is because you've tried multiple things.
Yeah.
You've applied for multiple jobs within there, but so far there hasn't been something that kind of met the mature Anthony and the responsibility he has, as well as, you know, use your skill set, you know, paid some bills, and maybe kind of was interesting or whatever. And you've been patient, which is good, but some of the challenge isn't all just internal trying to figure it out, but you keep knocking on doors and it doesn't seem like you've quite found the fit. Is that
it is
yeah,
it's not quite
unpack
so
them more, because I know so many people are with that.
Yeah. Look, I mean, maybe just the disclaimer too, like I realize how like privileged and lucky I am to be able to have choice, where if you are a dentist, like my father-in-law, like you're a dentist and you go to work every day and you have sort of a pretty predictable kind of career path. And it's a lot different than, you know, we talk about knowledge work or people working in startups or technology. So I realized that
it's a little more abstract.
Yeah. And I have, to your point, I got, you know, you heard in episode 1, like I told my story, but I had some early career success, which gives me an opportunity to take a step back and look and be like, well, what do I want to do? And so I want to just check that to say, like, that's not, I appreciate for a lot of folks listening that may or may not be the same kind of story that they have in their career. And so I've been consulting to pay the bills while I figure out what I want to do and going to seminary. And so, I mean, I think the thing is, it goes back to this last conversation though, because do you, like, and I've used the word emo, you've referenced some music videos we've done in the past. Like I'm kind of a romantic about things like this because I'm a thinker. I'm an emotional person. And so I think about what problem can I fall in love with and dedicate my life to working on. And if what I'm working on every day, I don't have that kind of like emotional relationship with, that ladders up to a broader sense of calling and impact and all of that, then I don't want to open that door. And where I'm at this intersection is the problem that I've been in love with for the last 15 years. Do I still feel that way now? Because a lot has changed. And so I would say that's probably the bigger thing. So if I were to tell you, I just want to keep going and do what I've been doing, then, you know, it's the same sort of, you know, reach out to the same recruiters, kind of talk, you know, do some networking into that kind of industry and go from there. I've been drawn to this conversation around not necessarily contributing my time to accelerating AI's development, but rather to help serve the humanity on the other side of this transformation and disruption, which is a very different problem. And so what I don't know in full candor, and I'm exploring, which is why I'm not like jumping into the next job right now,
Yeah.
is is that sort of a binary thing? Yeah,
Mm.
or is there a world, as we talked about last week, for Christians to be working in tech and to like, I think that's a really important and good thing,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
now,
Yep.
helping form the models, helping to apply the technology to virtuous use cases, right? That are helping the
Yeah.
world, and in many cases, expanding, the reach of the gospel and the impact that believers can have. Um, or is it like I need to become a pastor, an executive coach, a community builder for
Mhm.
humans that are part of that disruption? So, we haven't talked about this. I'm helping join this nonprofit that is basically helping serve Gen Z folks graduating into this disruption,
Yep.
who are graduating top of their class. They've kind of had their whole kind of career plan in front of them. They get to
Yeah.
this moment and
Yeah.
everything changes. How can we help them kind of navigate the transformation, get their career started, and sort of upskill
Yeah.
where needed, and so on? So in my story, what I don't know yet is, do I go all in on any one of those poles, or is there a world where I could sort of do both? And what I'm learning is that box number one is fairly geographically focused on San
Mhm.
Francisco and New York City.
Yeah.
It may not always be like that, right? Maybe
Yeah.
there's a lot of leverage now, and where the capital is kind of, going, and the cultures are forming. That's kind of
Yeah.
what's happening today. But that's for the top companies. That seems to be the case, and that infringes on this boundary. So that's where we have friction in my story in
Yeah.
particular. Um,
Yeah.
so I would say, if you're listening and you're in Gen Z, you definitely there, and especially so if you want to work in technology or industries where AI is quickly creating automation, then you too are facing this pressure, likely, right? And then you have my cohort, the sort of mid-career folks that are saying, "Oh, we spent 20 years doing it this way. What, we have to like relearn it all and unlearn it?" And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
by the way, like, there's younger folks that can do it at scale because they could tap a knowledge database that has lived in my head for the last 20 years. That's crazy, and something that
Yep.
we too are
Yep.
navigating. So I think it's those groups,
Yeah.
in particular, that are the most impacted. But maybe just to land the plane, like, if I just, the romantic in me, with a deep sense of conviction around calling, I think can make this decision a lot faster, or can make it
Hmm.
a lot with a lot more confidence. And so
Yeah.
that's my prayer, and that's my
Well, I think you might have.
continual.
I think you might have a bit of an answer. Like, the answer is your most meaningful work is going to be continue to find people who are experiencing the disorientation, um, from career, faith, or tech, or all three,
Yeah.
and to be a companion for them, you know,
Yeah.
and to meet them in that space, and to share your stories, and in some ways to show your scars, you know, say,
Yeah.
hey, I spent time in this space, and so really it doesn't matter what else you do, like, whether,
Mm.
and again, as long as you and your wife are saying, hey, well, we can try this travel thing and work this out, that you could do all of that, but you can't let that replace, the other. Like,
For
the
sure.
one thing that you're going to be about is trying to continue to help people navigate this AI world, because you love it. You're so fascinated by it. I mean,
Yeah.
Anthony's texting me all this stuff on X or whatever. It's like, dude, check this out, check this out, check it. And that's wonderful to have a brain that not only can comprehend but actually enjoys learning about the tech and figuring out the tech, and then trying
Yeah.
to figure out how to take that and make it practical to everyday life and in your own life and your own career. I mean, you've played around and toyed around with this stuff, and you've created apps for your chore chart at home, just
Right.
using AI. Like, it's all wonderful. So you have that, but then you have all of this career knowledge and understanding, and kind of these different paths you've tried, and different, hats you've worn or whatever uniforms you've
Yeah.
worn. That's going to be so helpful to meet people where they're at. But then you're developing this faith component too, and the philosophy of it all, and the understanding of work. And so, I mean, I just think I think little of Paul. So Saul in the Bible was very anti-Christian, and then at one point he came to know Jesus, and ended up becoming a Christian, and his name was changed from Saul to Paul at some point. And Paul, had a whole skill set, and it was to be a Pharisee and to a teacher of the law and keeper of the law. But what God called him to do for the Jewish people, but the Lord called Paul to do was to take the good news about Jesus to the Gentile world. And so before Paul did anything, he spent 10 years in Arabia just, having to learn. And Paul was such an action guy. So it was like God just had to take him out, steep him in all of this stuff to make him effective for the next season. And it was 10 years long.
Yeah, right.
Which is just crazy. You think about
David. The wilderness concept, right?
The wilderness,
we brought up before.
Yeah. King David, he killed Goliath. He married Saul's daughter, King Saul's daughter. He was on his way. He was anointed by Samuel. He was on his way. But that was probably when he was, maybe 15, 16, 17, 18. He was a teenager probably when all of that took place.
Yeah.
But then he didn't even become king until he was about 36 or 37. So there's this, and a lot of that, he had to, run away from Saul and live in the desert and all this. So I just keep thinking that, like God does oftentimes, to make us more effective in the calling that we have, he'll take us through things that do that. And so, there's a verse in the Bible that says that we're to comfort others with the comfort that we've received. And so in some ways, it's been fun for me to, at the same time, think you're going through a lot of this wrestling within your own soul. And I mean, and you're doing it well. And like you said, it's like you've had jobs and you've had opportunities, but you're trying to figure out how to not go without real clarity and all of these things. And yet all of this wrestling that you're going through, you're going to find the Lord, you're going to find the peace, you're going to find the comfort, and you're going to be able to comfort others who are going through the same thing with the comfort that you've received because you've gone through it, Yes. And so even like my back issues, I've had back issues this whole year, and it's been so interesting how I've had so many people in our church that I don't know. They've come here for 5 years, 10 years, 3 years. Wow. And for the first time, though, they're coming to me saying, hey, I've had back issues, or I have nerve pain, or I have this thing. And here's what helped me. And I'm getting to know them, these people that like we've been together to some extent, but now I'm getting to know them in a whole new way, just because I have pain. I have this kind of prolonged chronic pain reality. So they're trying to comfort me with the comfort they've received. So they're pastoring me through this time, which is so wonderful. And there's a depth of relationship that's happening, and I'm so thankful for all the people who are doing that. But yeah, it's just an interesting reality. So I know that's going to be part of, whatever's part next for Anthony Cannata. And I think the more you're rooted in that, then honestly, I mean, it doesn't totally matter. There's this crazy phrase that comes up in ancient Christian writing, and there's a little bit of discussion about who it originated from, but it's this phrase: love God and do whatever you want. And I think, to the American mind, I don't know if I would say that very much, because we might focus a little bit more on the do whatever you want than the love God. But basically what they're saying is if you're loving God, if you're doing the thing that God has asked you to do, if your awareness of God is there every day, then do whatever you want. Yeah. To the pure, all things are pure. Paul wrote that as well. And so I think in some ways, as long as your heart belongs to God, as long as you're seeking him first, as long as you know some of the things he's asked you to do, then as far as career goes, I mean, you got a lot of years to fill. If you're going to be 90 years old, you got some decades to fill. So try it all, man. Jump in. And I think, I had a friend who kind of went through a similar thing, I think, that you're going through with some job shifting. he wasn't sure if this job was the right job for him, and it was going to tax, some of his family dynamics. But his wife was saying, go for it. It seemed like a good thing. It was a good career move for him. And he went for it. And we just, every month we would check in, and I'd be like, how's it going? He's like, well, it's going pretty good, And then after another month, it was like, well, it's really stretching. And then after another month, I really don't know if this, like, all the gains that I've got might be less than what I had before. And then he went another month, and there was like this crisis at work where basically he had to decide, am I going to compromise in my ethics and values in order to continue to go along with this? Or am I going to say, hey, I'm not going to do that because that doesn't seem right to me? And so he ended up saying, I'm not going to do that. That didn't seem right to me. Bam. They let him go like 30 days later, and he got his answer. I was like,
right.
Perfect. Like,
totally.
And there's no fault, especially if you and your wife are in accordance, and he was seeking the Lord and he wasn't getting a big no from the Lord. It was like, go and let the Lord work it out, Yeah. And then the only problem was being if he's like, I want this so bad. Now I'm willing to compromise my ethics and values. Now I'm going to stay in this job, even though I know it's not what's best for my family. Like, that's where you got to be able to undo. You got to be able to pull the plug if it's not the Lord, if that's becoming clear. But sometimes it's hard to know. And sometimes I feel like God's saying, I trust you. Go for it. Let's see what happens.
Totally. There's something in that I think I needed to hear today. So thank you. There's like freedom in trusting the Lord, in that my flesh, I don't know if it's flesh or just like the human condition generally, but like I tend to just ruminate and just think about all the bad things and that could happen. And by saying yes to this, that means I'm saying no to that. And so I think part of this, part of the encouragement for others that might be in a similar place is with that, trust the Lord, or was it love the Lord and do what you want.
Yeah,
is like, take a risk, like, take a faithful step forward, and it may not be like the perfect dream job or whatever, or it might be, and if it's not, leave it and go find something that is. And ultimately, like, not everything is sort of this one-way door that you have to sort of like feel the mental oppression around and burden yourself to make these decisions. And my default is to do that. And so what I'm hearing today is like, let that go, like, just let that go, and see where the Holy Spirit's leading you and what doors might open with each faithful step.
There's this verse in Isaiah. It says, the Lord waits on you to be gracious to you. And I've always just, like, that verse is so revolutionary to me, because so often I'm like, I don't want to make a move unless God tells me to do it, so that way I know he'll bless me. And that's not freedom. That's slavery in some ways. Like, I'm so scared to make a mistake, or so scared that I'm going to do the wrong thing, that I'm frozen and I won't even do anything. And what this verse is saying is like, try something that you think God would be into, and watch how he blesses it, or whatever, or you got it wrong, and then you just try again, So I think there's this shift. And one of this old preacher guy used to always say, God can't steer a parked car. And the idea is like, if you're not moving, you can turn the wheel all you want, but you're not going to, there's no turning. But if you're moving, it's so much easier to steer something. And so in some ways, I think God's just saying, hey, like, you're my child. This whole world I made for you. Like, go garden, go try things, go invest. Yeah, you're not going to get it right all the time, but when you're getting it wrong, I will nudge you, or I will block the path, even if I have to have a donkey talk to you like Balaam, it's like, whatever it takes, you will know when you're going the wrong way. I'm not going to let you go the wrong way without knowing it. And when you're going the right way, maybe I'm not going to say so much to you. You just need to know because you're going the right way, And so there's something in all of that. Yeah, something in all of that. I think that's important. And I'll bring this back to kind of the 4th of July and the founding fathers and all these things, because I was thinking about this. where I was like, what would those guys, those framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, what would they say the telos of man was? And I don't know if I have a real strong answer, except for there's very clearly they had a Christian worldview. Very clearly, they believed that telos was not, all you could gain, but basically the ability to live according to your convictions. Right? That's part of the reason they left England
Right.
and wanted to make a new nation was because they were not able to live according to their convictions because of what was mandated there. And so they wrote and framed this Declaration of Independence and this Constitution to basically say, hey, we're going to create an environment, a society where people can live according to their convictions. There will be freedom of religion. And again, that's a little scary because to some extent that gives room for other religions to live according to their convictions. Yet they were going to create some sort of environment to where it was safe for everyone to do that. And if there was a violation of, the safety of an individual's rights, then there would be consequences. But as long as everyone was just kind of, taking care of themselves and not harming the others, then there was going to be freedom there. And it's really created this amazing amount of freedom. But what they said was, the life, the life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Like these are the inalienable rights. We want everyone to be able to have life, and liberty, and then the pursuit of happiness. Because I love that phrase because they knew it's all soap bubbles, right? Happiness is so fleeting. It's vapor. It's hovel, hovel, hovel. But if you want to pursue what's most meaningful for you, you should be able to pursue that. We're not going to guarantee you're going to be happy or anything like that.
Right.
But I thought, again, going back to that's another attempt from humanity to figure out what the telos of man is, and then to create an environment where human flourishing according to that was most possible. And again, in a lot of ways, and with major failures and major corrections throughout, this has been a place where I think that really has been the idea is we don't necessarily have to define for everybody exactly what they're supposed to do, but let's just create a space where the people who understand what they're supposed to do can go and do those things. Now, again, I think the challenge was the population at that time did have a biblical worldview, even if they didn't necessarily like God or anything. I think they still were framed by that. And they did have an understanding of what, human flourishing was according to biblical principles. And so it's been tricky as now we have a society that is, somewhat, many are educated with a Christian worldview and many are not. They don't even know what the Christian worldview is, or what they know of the Christian worldview they hate because they've got a misrepresentation of it. And then we also have, such a diverse society. I mean, I feel like we should pray for our leaders and our politicians and our business owners and all these things, because the job that they have to do is immensely challenging. I mean, really again, I have 3 teenage daughters, and I don't even know. We struggle to make a decision of where to go eat, let alone have 200 or 300 million people, with all their passions and intensities, and try and figure out how to work in harmony. And I think we should give them a lot of slack here and there. And then again, I think with the media and the surprise of how many people have come from Europe and thought, man, America is actually great. All I hear is how horrible it is all the time. Like, we're just not. We're so disadvantaged in a lot of ways, and we should provide a lot more grace for each other. I think that will stand against the dehumanizing. I do think we have to stand against bad ideas. I think we have to call out bad ideas, but I think people are still God's favorite thing, and they should kind of be our favorite thing as well. And keep working on this experiment, like you said, for sure.
Amen.
Yeah. Any final comments on any of that?
No, it's just beautiful. I think that's right. And it's important, I think, for Christian Americans to deeply feel that and feel some sort of responsibility, might be a strong word, but role in upkeeping it and protecting it. I'm not a very political person, despite this tour of duty I'm doing. But it has definitely woken up within me a sense of civic responsibility. And again, not to suggest I'm going to like never work for the federal government or near it again, personally. But I am just so proud to be an American and all that stands for. And I feel like we have a role to play in, as you opened this podcast with, defending her. Whatever that may be.
I love that. And you said Christian American, and I think that order is very important.
That's absolutely right.
I think Christians helped create and frame this thing, this American experience, and I think Christians should still help to create and frame, as much as we can, and play that part. And that goes for voting, but also do it like, again, it's not the end of the world. It's like, we're gonna make mistakes, but keep doing it. It's funny. I actually told this group I was standing in front of at this other church, and they asked me a question, and we were discussing this thing, and I actually said, I thought in my mind, I'm going to tell them who I voted for, and I was in my mind, I'm like, is that safe? And I said, I said, no, it's not safe, and I said, but I want everyone to know that it's not that big a deal. Like, I think voting is a big deal. Who you voted for, at the end of the day, I can say this because it's not so important to me that I want to fight everyone, whether you like what I voted for or not. And it's not the most important thing that I'm saying right now, even though this might be the only thing they take away from it. Like, it's literally, I voted for this person, and then in a few years, I'm going to vote for somebody else, and I'm going to learn from what I did, and I had my convictions and why I voted for this person. And so I told him, I was like, so this is who I voted for, and I had my reasons, but I do think voting is important, and so my point in this is not who you vote for is the most important thing. I think voting is important. I think playing a role in our civic duty to try and do what we can to promote human flourishing in our governmental system and all those things. So it was kind of funny, and nobody fought me. I didn't know one threw anything at me, and I do think who I voted for was probably the opposite of who most people voted for in the room, which was kind of fun, which is kind of why it's more important that I did that. Say, can you still
the point of what you were trying to say?
Yeah,
right.
Can you still receive me and all the things that we've talked about for an hour now that you know this, or does it erase everything good and I'm all bad? And I don't know, it really kind of just challenged, and it was cool because afterwards I had great conversations with people, and I'm sure people that didn't vote the same way I did. So anyways, it was kind of fun to do that. And no, I'm not going to say it on this podcast because they weren't live streaming. They weren't live streaming.
Yeah, exactly.
And not that it's a big deal to me, but I just, if somebody wanted to do something weird or bad, I don't want to give them that chance. But
no, I think that's good. I think that's good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for the time. Happy 250th birthday to you, America. Looking forward to a lot of other good ones. And if you want to comment, if you want to email, if you want to connect with us in any way, I know on Instagram, we've been posting some little clips here and there. So I've seen some comments there, which is great. And thanks to all the people who've texted me, people who used to come to Living Streams or, different parts of the world now, texted and said, hey, I'm following the podcast. It's so great. Nice. So thanks for the encouragement there. That's a lot of fun. And we'll be back at it next week with a new conversation and then Sunday with another sermon. But God bless you all, and we'll see you soon.